wake of Penn State and the tragedy that's happened there, our board asked us to take a look at our own internal policies, which we've done. We've revised our own background check and child safety system and policy. And we're really fortunate. On our board, there's an organization called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It's the best organization of youth safety in the world. So there's an international center and there's a national center. And we are fortunate that we've got board members on our board that also serve on that board. Robbie Calloway is one of the founders of the National Center. John Ryan, Christine's dad, is the current president and CEO of the National Center. And prior to that, he was the chairman of the board. Manus Cooney is the vice chairman or chairman-elect of that board. He's on our board. So we're really fortunate. We have a lot of expertise. We also have a sitting judge on our board, Laura Kiesling, who was a child prosecutor, child victimization prosecutor. We have a woman, Linda Rossi, who was the Secretary of Child Safe, Secretary of what, Kevin, help me out? Children's Services, Children and Family, Juvenile Justice, I guess different names in different states. Texas, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island. She served as the secretary and all those things. Wealth of experience. So we all came together and we looked at our own policy and updated it. And I think it's probably one of the best of any organization in the country. But more importantly than that, what we did was we took that policy. Joellen and Carmen have been leading this for us. We took that policy and we crafted it in a way that any organization that needs help in this area of child safety can use it. I want to say it's a fill in the blank for policy, but it gives them the tools they need to help keep the kids safe. What most organizations do, not many, most, is they avoid this issue altogether. They don't want to know. They feel better not knowing, rather than feeling better about knowing they're doing everything they can, whether we know it or not, they have in every organization. And the numbers, I'm doing this from memory, but 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 7 boys are victims at some point in their life of sexual exploitation, which is a broad term. There's an FBI survey study that was done on incarcerated pedophiles, right? And according to pedophiles who are in prison, they commit 150 acts of molestation before they get caught. Did I get that right?
Right.
That's before they get caught. So think about the numbers of lives they've ruined. One kid gets molested, and it not only ruins their current family situation, it ruins their future. And so it's a generational change for the worse, or if we help them for the better. So that's what we're trying to do. And there's a lot more information I can tell you, but I don't want to keep Dr. Cooper. We're very fortunate to have, if not the most renowned expert in the world, certainly in the country, Sharon Cooper and Carmen, who came to us from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and has real expertise in this area, is going to introduce Dr. Cooper.
All right, so thank you guys for coming in this morning. For those of you who this is the first time you're hearing Dr. Cooper speak, I told Jeff that he would love hearing Dr. Cooper. I could listen to her for a week. We are very privileged to have her here. It's a very unique opportunity. And you have her bio, and she asked me not to read the whole thing, and I'm not going to, but I do want you to know some highlights. Dr. Cooper has been in pediatrics for 35 years. She's the CEO of Development Forensic Pediatrics in North Carolina. She consults with the National Center, has done so for years. She is a speaker nationally and internationally, over 300 conferences. She also provides expert testimony for the FBI and other law enforcement agencies on issues involving sex trafficking, child sexual exploitation, and other issues related to youth. So this is the best opportunity we're going to have to ask questions about this issue, to arm ourselves so that we can protect the children who are involved in our programs and our camps. And I want you to help me give her a very good welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Carmen, and thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. And let me start out by just saying that I am, in fact, a pediatrician, and I'm a developmental and forensic pediatrician, which means that I did general pediatrics for a few years, and then I did a fellowship in developmental and behavioral pediatrics. So therefore, I've had an opportunity since the 80s to see lots of children who have developmental problems, who have school problems, ADHD, learning disabilities, preemies who have graduated from NICUs. And I also see children who have been victims of crime. So therefore, I hope that I'll be able to bring to you a perspective of kids who may be coming into the camping experiences and to the team sport experiences that will help us to protect them better, but also to recognize. I added the word recognition to child sexual abuse because you can't prevent something if you don't recognize it. So I'm going to hopefully help you with this particular process. And being a pediatrician, I want you to know that I really understand people who become agreeable like this. You know, and if you are an aisle sitter and you become agreeable, I'll help you. Stay with me. So beware if you're sitting on an aisle. It is an honor for me to be with you, and I want to talk for a few minutes about the fact that when we talk about child sexual abuse, you first need to know where we are. We used to have this term sexual abuse, and that used to encompass everything. But about 1996 or so, we started seeing this issue of internet facilitation of sexual abuse of children. And that's because around 1996, the internet became publicly available. It had been available to the Department of Defense and to universities for years before that time. But once we started having public availability, not only were people using the internet for information gathering, but also they began to recognize that they could network. And I think that's when I first started getting involved with the whole issue of sexual exploitation. Because in the beginning, in the late 90s and the very beginning part of 2000, what we started to see on the internet were people who would talk to each other about their penchants, what they liked. These were networks that started, news groups, where individuals would talk about their favorite pastimes. And this is the first time that we really started reading chat from individuals who had preferential interests in children. We found that there were more than 7,000 news groups at that particular point of people who were talking about how to access children, to sexually abuse them. And just recently this year, in fact, I was interviewed on a television station on a grooming guide that had been found in an investigation involving child sexual abuse. In this particular case, the offender, who had sexually abused several children, was arrested, and when the police went into his home, they found on his computer already printed out in hard copy, a 186-page document that had color pictures every second page of very young, very beautiful, innocent-looking children, and a how-to on how to groom the children and how to groom their families in order to be able to sexually abuse them. These kinds of grooming guides are available on the internet. And this particular television station was so astounded and appalled that they really wanted to bring this to the attention of others. So we are in a sort of a new place today, and it is really far thinking on your part as an organization to get training in this particular area, because you cannot prevent something that you do not recognize. If you don't recognize it, or even if you don't recognize the possibility and potential for victimization, you will not be able to prevent victimization. Good morning. This is the classic presentation of a child sexual abuse victim. They do not have a voice. This is very common. Most children who have been sexually abused do not tell you in childhood. That has been studied quite a bit. Boys tell you even less, but let me tell you how that research came about. In the late 80s, 1988, Dr. Rochelle Hansen from the University of South Carolina did a telephone survey of adult women. She asked a lot of questions, but one of the things that she asked was, did you ever have an unwanted sexual experience as a child, which is code for child sexual abuse? Of the women who said yes, that happened to me, she then asked an additional question, and that was, did you ever tell as a child? And in the late 80s, 6% of adult women who said that they had had an unwanted sexual experience as a child, told as a child. That meant 94% of girls did not tell in childhood. She repeated that study around the end of 1990, almost in the year 2000. She did the exact same type of study. And that was after we had had things like Oxygen television and lots of movies that really highlighted the reality of child sexual abuse, et cetera. And therefore, 10 years later, when she repeated that study, a whopping 12% of adult women said, yes, I told as a child. So that meant that 88% of victims did not tell in childhood, and those are the girls. When we think about the boys and we look at many of the high-profile multi-victim cases, almost always we see non-disclosure. So not telling is the rule more so than the exception. And I love it when I'm on a witness stand and a defense attorney makes the error of asking me, and so doctor, if this really happened, why didn't they tell? I love for them to ask me that question because then I'll say, well, it'd be very abnormal for a child to make a disclosure because it takes a lot of courage. A lot of times if it's an intrafamilial case, they feel about the ramifications of what's going to happen to my grandfather or my uncle or whomever. Nobody's going to believe me. In fact, offenders often tell victims that no one's going to believe them, or they believe it's their fault, because that's a common, it's referred to as a cognitive distortion in literature. Offenders usually will say when they're talking to law enforcement, well, you know, I really didn't want to do it, but she came and she sat on my lap and I said, no, I want to look at the game. You know, why don't you go back into the other room? She said, oh, no, I want to sit on your lap, and she just made me do it. That's a cognitive distortion that is frequently seen by psychologists who do treatment for sex offenders. So this cognitive distortion on the part of a sex offender is often promoted to the victim. And when the victim is a child, especially a child who's a relation to the offender or an acquaintance, because those are the most common offenders. It's not a stranger who is usually sexually offending a child. It is an acquaintance or a family member who is going to be the most likely offender in that situation, and we have that challenge. So this child without a voice, this child without a mouth, is going to be the kind of child that's going to come into any kind of recreational system, because we do see this very commonly. So let me define for you what child sexual abuse is. It's any sexual contact with a child where consent is not or cannot be given. Consent is a moot point. And those of us who work with law enforcement understand that really well. Families don't necessarily understand that so well. Looked as if she was not fighting. You know, I've had parents to say to me when I evaluate child sexual abuse victims in one of my clinics, I've had parents to say, well, doctor, I just know it can't be true because when she comes down for breakfast and he's at the kitchen table, she doesn't act like he raped her. You know, that's what mothers have said to me on numerous occasions. And I have to help them understand, well, this is her dad. She loves him, and she wants to be loved by him. And the fact that he has touched her in a way that isn't right and that she knows isn't right doesn't mean she doesn't still love this person. And so therefore you can't just look at a child's behavior from that perspective because they don't always have an aversion to the offender. This includes sexual contact by force or threat of force, regardless of the age of the participants, and all sexual contact between an adult and a child, regardless of whether there's a deception or the child understands the sexual nature of the activity. Now, why this is so important is because when you think about kids who are in youth-serving organizations, not only will you have kids who have been victims who will come into that youth-serving organization, but you will also have kids who are going to be offenders or who have already been offenders that you don't know about in a youth-serving organization. The most common scenario that we see with a youth offender is that this is typically a youth who will offend against, again, a relative or an acquaintance. And they may offend against a very young child who is nonverbal or preverbal, or they may offend against a child under the guise of a game. This is one of the most common things that I see in my youth offender cases, where a 12-year-old is playing a video game with a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old. And if you lose, then what you have to do is take your clothes off, or you have to do some type of sexual act on behest of the 12-year-old. And many of my children that I evaluate who have been the victims of this type of ruse will say to me, you know, they're really mad at themselves. They're saying, I hate that I lost because this is what I had to do and it was icky and I didn't want to do it. I wish I had a won. You see the difference. The child feels responsible for what happened to them. Not that the offender did anything to them. It was their fault because they didn't win the game. So that's a deterrent to making a disclosure because the child doesn't recognize that they've been exploited in that manner. They don't understand that they've been taken advantage of. So youth sex offenders are another category of kids that will clearly at times be in your population. And that then begs for careful monitoring because remember, most youth sex offenders are unrecognized. Here's the classic situation. A youth offender offends against a younger cousin. The younger cousin might make a disclosure to grandmother or somebody who is the caregiver. What happens to the case then? You can tell me, what do you think? I'll ask this row over here. What do you think, you know, the child goes to the grandmother and says, you know, so-and-so did this to me, Grandma, and I'm really mad. What's the grandmother likely to do? What do you think?
Not necessarily believe it.
She might very well have disbelief. Oh, don't say that kind of stuff. You better not talk about your cousin that way. That's one option. What else?
Ignore it, kind of shrug it off.
Right. She'll say, Johnny, don't you do anything like that to him anymore. You know better than that. Anything else?
Be defensive, maybe?
She might be defensive, or worse, she might spank or beat the disclosure. How dare you say that kind of stuff to me? Go get my whip. Go get my belt. You're not going to tell me things like that. I don't like lies in my house. So it can go beyond just denial. It can go to punishment, which, what does that do to a victim? What's the likelihood that they'll tell anymore? Great? Small? Small. Precisely. So when you recognize that this can be the reaction of family members when a child makes a disclosure, you can understand why youth sex offenders can fly under the radar very readily for long periods of time. And they may very well have been offending against other children for a long time.